Good afternoon, Kirk. How are you doing today?
I think I'm doing well. I was just actually responding to a comment on my channel, and it's a beautiful day here for a fall day in Canada. Just gorgeous.
It's 20, well, it's 18 right now. Supposed to be getting up to 22, and that's Celsius, so 72 degrees ish Fahrenheit. And we're going to pay for it later here in Manitoba, but I'm enjoying every second of this. I threw the shorts on today. I'm going to live this good weather. So what's the comment?
Well, it's actually part of a thread, and I guess to make to make sense of the comment, the whole thread would have to be looked at. Except maybe I can just pick one thing out. He says there is no scientific consensus if the universe had a beginning or not. Now, that's part of a larger thread. And the problem with that, it's what we call an assertion. First of all, an assertion without any, an assertion is, let's contrast that with a conclusion, a logical conclusion. So let's say you have a discussion and there's a number of points raised, and the result of that point, those points, infer some sort of a conclusion, a rational conclusion. And if somebody said, how did you get to that conclusion? You can point to the premises that logically led to that conclusion. An assertion is different. It is a conclusion with no supporting premises or evidence. It's just simply a statement. And so in this case, when someone says there is no scientific consensus if the universe had a beginning or not, and fails to provide any evidence to support that, that simply is an assertion. Now, that doesn't mean it's true or false. An assertion could be true, might be false, but because it's someone who just simply states it, you really can't go either way on it. Now, in this case, however, the vast majority of scientists, of cosmologists, and theoretical physicists do concede or grant that the universe would have had to have a beginning. In fact, there was an excellent article in New Scientist several years ago. And in that article, I think it was titled, Why Physicists Cannot Escape a Creation Event. And they quoted Steven Weinberg and so forth in that article. Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking worked very, very hard to try and somehow wiggle out of having to concede the universe had a beginning. And in the end, never actually was able to do that. There are mathematical models, of course, and this is an important point, because you will often hear cosmologists or theoretical physicists talk about mathematical models for an eternal universe. That is, a universe that existed eternally in the past. But I had a conversation with a cosmologist out at University of British Columbia several years ago. He made a critical point here, and the critical point is this. In order for the mathematical model to model physical reality, every key component of that mathematical model must correspond to something in reality, and none do. It's not just that maybe one or two do. No, none do when it comes to an eternal universe. There are lots of mathematical models of an eternal universe, or one that had no beginning. They're easy to make. But when you try and apply these to reality, there is a massive problem due to a property of countable infinite sets. That is, massive problem with trying to traverse an infinite number of prior events before you get to this conversation we're having today. It's impossible due to a property of countable infinite sets. You never actually make any progress counting down from minus infinity to zero, if we call this zero.
Just a sec.
Yeah, it might be urgent. So this might be a bit of a different live stream today, I hear, because
Yeah.
we're not only talking about maybe responding to a few comments, but also bear encounters. And
Bear encounters. So, yeah. So the reason we're talking bear encounters is about an hour ago, I'm like, "Hey, Kirk, you want to do a live stream today?" And you said, "Sure." And then we said, "What topic?" And you said, "Bear encounters." And I was like, "Sounds good."
I was joking when I said that, but I actually have, because I grew up in bear country, I have quite a few interesting ones.
Yeah. So, like, when I was gone for the last week at some meetings, actually, if you look behind me, this canoe picture is taken at Loon Lake, just north of Maple Ridge in BC. So, if you go from Vancouver to Maple Ridge, which is just across the river, about a 20-minute drive from downtown Vancouver, you end up in a suburb. And if you leave the suburb by going through a gate at the end of a road, and then you go up 15 minutes up a logging trail, you end up at Loon Lake Retreat Center, which is part of UBC's forestry system. And so that's a picture just off a dock at a lake that we have our retreats at.
Beautiful.
And yeah, you can't beat it. Now, this was taken last year because this year there was no sun. We had no sun. It was rain, rain, rain. And I guess we got there the day it started raining in BC. And I guess in April it'll usually stop raining in February for a few weeks and then it'll start up again. But when we got there, you walk into this log cabin, big log cabin with like 20 hotel room type things. But on the door, it said bear in area, and there's a picture of a bear. And so, yeah, I just thought your bear encounters, and then I never saw a bear, but mainly because we never went outside except for one little walk. But yeah, so tell me, now you sent me a picture of your mom. Do you want to start there or?
That's actually my grandmother.
Or grandmother. Okay.
Yeah.
So do we start there or you want me to pull that up later?
Well, I mean, I think let's pull it up later in case somebody else shows up for the live stream. Although, let's see, I'm sure appropriate time will arise. But just as you were talking about that, it reminded me of one of my many close encounters and with bears. In this case, it was a grizzly. My son, one of my boys, persuaded me to go on about a 7-day hike in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area of Montana. And I was totally unprepared. I had a 45-pound pack, and I imagined we would be walking on nice trails that had cedar mulch on them, about 6 feet wide cedar mulch. That was not the case. We spent the first, I only kept my feet dry for about the first 20 minutes until it's time to cross a stream. And we hiked for about, it was about a 18 to 20 mile hike that first day. We went over the Continental Divide that first day. And what else about that first? Countless fallen trees climbing over. There was no nice trail with cedar mulch on it. That was a fantasy. I was badly mistaken. So by the end of the day, I was just wrecked. I was twice the age of all the other guys. And so I went to bed we pitched our tents in some remote, like beside a river, far from civilization, no roads, nothing. And all fell nicely asleep. The next morning we got up, and not about 25 yards from my tent was a nice, fresh, steaming pile of bear stool. And it was grizzly. So you can always tell the grizzly tracks from the black bear tracks, because grizzly tracks have these gigantic claw markings ahead of each toe, whereas the black bears will just have a small dimple in front of their toe from their little claws. But the grizzlies have claws as long as your fingers. But fortunately, they just kept moving on. And no, that was that was disturbing, but it wasn't really a face-to-face encounter. I've had several of those face-to-face, very close encounters with black bears.
Yeah, we used to have black bears in our backyard when I lived in Squamish, British Columbia. We'd have just outside our fence, it was forest, and so there was always bears in the area. And the black bears, they're a little bit scary if you run into one. There was a TikTok or a Twitter video the other day where somebody was out walking or climbing a mountain, and a bear came to visit them, and they freaked out. And we think it was just a teenager bear. It wasn't it wasn't a mom protecting their kids or anything like that. But oh man, you don't want to meet one of those on a trail.
No, I mean most black bears, the vast majority will just they're not they'll just leave you alone, the vast majority. But it's that, let's say that 5 out of 100, or that whatever it is, 2 out of 100. I don't know what the actual stats are, that decide that they're hungry and you're lunch. Now, the interesting thing about a black bear in general is that when they attack you, when they trail you and track you down, it's usually with the purpose of eating you. So you don't play dead. That just helps them. Whereas a grizzly, and I'm generalizing here, but a grizzly, it's often because they perceive you as some sort of a threat. And so there's a difference. Black bears don't have the same reputation of injuries that grizzlies do, but unfortunately, there are still 1 or 2 people each year that are killed by black bears, and often partially devoured by blacks. So you can't be just having the Walt Disney approach to bears in general.
Yeah, and they're not just after a picnic basket, although that is a very key thing that they want to do, is go after your food. Yeah. I know you've told a story in the past about camping and then having to chase down a bear that was bugging the other people in the campground.
Yeah, actually, I actually got caught by a bear with a stringer full of fish one time. Yeah, I was. We had walked in about a mile to this small wilderness lake, and spent the afternoon fishing there. And I had about 3 or 4 nice northern pike I was bringing back with me. And it was about a mile walk back out of the bush to where we'd parked our car. And about, a third of the way back, I walked around the corner. Now, keep in mind here, I had several people behind me, including my wife, some other, about 3 people behind me. Some were quite far back. There was a fellow immediately behind me, just immediately right following me along, and I was in the lead. And I walked around this, and this trail was it's just a path through the bush, basically. I rounded a corner, and there is a black bear, full-grown adult, and he's standing on his hind legs, looking at me from about, I don't know, like 8 yards away. And I'm standing there with a stringer full of fish. Instantly, I recall rapidly receding footsteps of the guy behind me. Now, he didn't grow up in bear country. And my grandmother had always taught me never, ever run from a predator. And there were several times where I actually got to apply that piece of wisdom. And this was one of them. So what happens, I find, is that when you find yourself suddenly face to face with a black bear, I find a massive muscle spasm, which is your brain. Your brain isn't involved here. The body says, get out of here as fast as you can right now. And all the muscles just instantly contract, ready for the sprint. But the brain says, hold it. Grandma says, don't run from a bear. So after the initial muscle snap, I stood there looking at the bear with my stringer full of fish, and coming up with plans. Plan A, start walking slowly backwards with my stringer full of fish. If he keeps coming for me, plan B, lay the stringer down on the path and keep walking backwards. Now, what if he's not happy with the stringer? What if he's going for something big? What if he's going for the jackpot and decides to come after me? So plan C, I started unbuckling my sheath knife, which had only a 6.5-inch blade. It's not, the prospects are not very, well, let's say not very exciting if that's your last plan, but that was plan C. So as I started backing up, he actually went for plan A, the bear did, and dropped to his feet after studying me for several seconds, or for 15 seconds or so, 20 maybe, dropped to his feet and took off through the bush. And that was the end of the having to part with my groceries, so to speak.
Yeah, he didn't want your fish. That's
No,
handy on your side.
you could see he wanted, the wheels were turning. He was trying to make a decision here. And fortunately, he made a good decision as far as I'm concerned.
For your sake. All right, so we got this picture. I'll pull it up. You can explain what's going on here.
Sure. Yeah. So the lady in that photograph is my grandmother. And this photograph would have been taken, I don't know, way back, probably in the late 1940s. I'm not sure. But what happened is that she was working away in the kitchen one afternoon, and she had 3 girls at the time, 3 girls, 3 daughters to take care of. She was working away in the kitchen of her house, and just off the kitchen was sort of a porch. It was where she kept a lot of stuff. And here, to her surprise, there was a bear in the porch, a black bear in the porch, basically, for all intents and purposes, in the house, because this was heavily used. This was part of the house, this porch. So the rifle, my grandfather's rifle, was actually in the porch with the black bear. And so my grandmother there was a door that between the porch and the kitchen. She closed the door and then waited until the black bear left the porch. Then she ran into the porch, grabbed grandpa's rifle, and she was so nervous she didn't bother to walk over to the door, but shot right through the window and dispatched the bear into the hereafter. And even though the window was not more than 2 feet from the door, and Grandpa, the report goes, was not very happy with his wife. Why didn't you just move over to the door rather than shooting through the window? But anyways, there's that. A couple of photos were taken of my grandmother and the bear that she shot, and they've gone down into the family archives now. But that place where she did this, and this house, that's where I used to go as a preschooler, and that's where I learned. That's where she taught me don't ever run from predators, because there were a ton of bears around where they grew up. It was right, actually, their farm bordered a national park, which had about 1,000 square miles of wilderness, and there are a lot of bears in that national park.
Where are they? Where were they?
That would have been Riding Mountain National Park, and their farm was bordering the north side of that park, south of a town called Dauphin.
Beautiful area. Beautiful area. All right. Well, let's take a few minutes just to talk through something you were talking about earlier a little bit. Whether the universe has a beginning or not. I don't know of a different segue to go from
nice
this
segue.
picture to universe had a beginning. But I think it's I'd like to camp there for a little bit, because this conversation's happening continually on your channel, I feel. And so how does, like, you talked about assertions, you talked about scientists' consensus. How do we know the universe has a beginning, or is it just a guess?
Well, okay, there's 2 ways. There's 2 things we can look at. First of all, we can look at science. And science observes that when you look out into the universe, the further those galaxies are away from us, the more they are redshifted on average. They're more redshifted. And redshifted simply means that they're moving away from us. It's similar to, let's say, if you were standing by a highway, a freeway, and cars are whizzing by, and let's say there's some sort of a noise that the truck or the car is making besides just the tires on the road. You'll notice that it's sort of high-pitched as it comes towards you, and as it passes, it's lower pitch. And the reason for that is that when it's coming towards you, the sound waves are closer together. And as it passes you, their sound waves are spaced out more because the source of that sound is moving at some velocity away from you rather than for you. Same goes for light waves. So when something moves towards you, the light that that galaxy is emitting tends to get compressed or shifted towards the blue end of the spectrum. But it's moving away from you, it tends to get stretched out towards the red end of the spectrum. So that's the first way that we decided that science came to the conclusion that, wow, like the universes are all moving outwards. So if you turn back the clock, obviously they all converge at some point in the past. And so that was our first indication that the universe had a beginning to its existence. There's another way to tell. It's just like, let's say you light a campfire and somebody and you only have a limited supply of wood and you use all that wood on your campfire. And somebody comes along and asks, has that fire been burning for an infinite length of time? And most people would look at the campfire and say no. And the reason it hasn't is that the wood would have all been burnt out infinitely long ago by now. Like if it was actually burning for an infinite amount of time, there's just not enough fuel to do it. In the same way, the entropy of the universe is let's call it the usable energy in the universe is slowly deteriorating. And even some of the fundamental particles are thought to be, or even some of the basic particles are thought to be unstable and have a half-life themselves. And eventually, given enough time, there'll be nothing left but a thin diffusing cloud of neutrinos and low energy radiation. Well, obviously that hasn't happened yet, so we can infer that the universe had a beginning again. So that's science. But the problem with science is that, well, maybe we'll discover something next week that would maybe next week all the galaxies start getting blue shifted. And then they get red shifted again, and it's sort of like a bouncing yo-yo type of effect, an oscillation, something like that. And so that's the problem.
Like that's where it's like, for me, not being a scientist at all, when I think of things that are like spinning and rotating, you get a universe that maybe it's in an orbiting concept where it's not just going away from us, but it'll eventually come back. How do we know that's not happening? Is everything moving away?
Well, not everything. I mean, on average, most stuff is the further out you go, the more it's moving away. There's more local things that are, like, say, the Andromeda Galaxy, for example, which is roughly 2.5 million light years from our galaxy, from us right here. The Andromeda Galaxy is actually moving toward us, and it's predicted to collide with our universe at some distant point in the future, and I can't remember when, but don't worry about it. It's not going to happen in your lifetime or anybody else's lifetime for 1,000,000 years or more. So that's moving toward us. But there is the problem, and some scientists have suggested, well, what if the universe sort of expands and slows down and then contracts again and bounces back again and then contracts again, like a perpetual motion machine that never ends? And so could this have been happening from eternity past? In which case, there is no beginning to the whole system. There's just a beginning to this particular bounce, but the whole system has no beginning, and therefore we don't need to worry about what caused this thing in the first place. Well, scientifically, one of the problems with that is the old perpetual motion machine problem, and that is that the entropy is not conserved between oscillations. What that means, practically speaking, is that with each bounce, it bounces back a little bit slower. It doesn't, or the mass, let's see, the radius keeps, yes, the radius keeps expanding with each bounce until eventually it doesn't collapse anymore. And so if it were infinitely old, we would not have that situation. We would have a situation where the universe is just expanding forever and ever outwards. But we haven't got there yet. That's not what's happening out there. So it still points to, even if the universe did bounce and oscillate back and forth like this in a number of different, each time a new universe exploding out of the remnants of the old, even that has to be has a beginning at a finite point in the past. So no matter what we do in science, the indication are that it had a beginning. So can we, but the problem, as I said, is what if we discover something that maybe turns everything on its head? There is another way to know that it had a beginning. So science provides some verification that it has a beginning, but it doesn't prove anything. Usually science works on a theory not being falsified, and therefore it lives to see another day. It seems to have some predictive power. It can be verified by observations, but you don't ever prove anything in science. But you can prove things in mathematics. And so using mathematics, we can know with certainty that the actual physical universe or nature or system that we live in had a beginning. And the reason that we know that is the problem of, if we assume an infinite past, let's say an infinite number of years, for example, or an infinite number of oscillations, each year of which takes a discrete amount of time, or each oscillation which takes a discrete amount of time. If the universe was eternal from the past, you would never get to this conversation here. And here's why. Let's imagine you had a bunch of shelves on your wall, and you had chocolate bars, a lot of chocolate bars on those shelves. Let's say 100 chocolate bars on the shelves on the wall. And you took one down and passed it around, and after everybody had finished eating that chocolate bar, you would only have 99 chocolate bars left to go. Then you take another one down, pass it around, and you'd have 98 chocolate bars left on the wall. And eventually you would get down to the last chocolate bar. And let's say somebody made up a rule and said, nobody gets out of here until all the chocolate bars are eaten, and you got to eat them one at a time. Well, eventually you would eat all those 100 chocolate bars, because with every chocolate bar you eat, the number of chocolate bars left on the shelf before you can go out is being reduced by one each time. But this is where an countable infinite number of chocolate bars makes all the difference in the world. So if you had an infinite number of chocolate bars on the wall, and you took one down and passed it around and everybody ate it, how many would you have left? The same amount. In other words, we don't really have an integer, like a number, when we say how many chocolate bars are on the wall. If there's an infinite number, we don't have a number, because any number you choose would be a finite number. Instead, we have a symbol that represents what's called the cardinality of an infinite set, or a countable infinite set, or let's layman's terms here, the number of chocolate bars contained in an infinite pile of chocolate bars. That symbol is called Aleph Null. It's just the Hebrew first letter of the Hebrew alphabet in mathematics. So here's the property that we're talking about. Well, let me pause here. What if you said, well, this is going to take a long time just eating one chocolate bar. Let's take 1,000 down at a time. And so you take 1,000 chocolate bars down at a time, you pass them around, eat them all up, and you take another 1,000 at a time. And let's say you do that for 1 billion years. The question is, how much progress have you made to cleaning up all the chocolate bars before you can leave the room? Well, the property of a countable infinite set says, no, you've made zero progress. You still have Aleph Null chocolate bars left to go. You never, ever get to this conversation that we're having here if the past contains an infinite number of events. Each one of it takes a discrete amount of time to unfold. You never, ever get here. But here we are having this conversation. And if you're virtually falling asleep, hopefully we got over the technical bits of this. And that's why we can know with certainty that the real universe that we live in cannot have existed for an infinite amount of time in the past. There is no infinite regression, let's say, if we were to go back. There has to be a beginning due to the mere fact that we are here now having this conversation, having traversed all the events in the past, which we would never be able to do if there was an infinite number of them.
Which is why, if you think of infinite number of universes, that's even a crazier proposition, because it's not just time is infinite, it's the number of universes is infinite, which you'll never get to today.
Well, an infinite number of universes adds a whole new layer of problems. It adds logical contradictions. And I don't know, I don't think I should probably explain why, but if you are interested, Google or do a search on your browser for Hilbert's Hotel. Hilbert's Hotel, Hilberts, Hilbert's Hotel. David Hilbert was a famous mathematician who, I don't know, died in the 1940s or 60s, somewhere in there, mid 1900s. And he wrote an interesting paper, or gave a lecture from which an article followed. And the title of the lecture was On the Infinite. And he argued in the lecture that nowhere in reality do we actually have an infinite number of real things. In mathematics, it's a very useful tool. And I have used it, I don't know, I suppose thousands of times. I've integrated, for example, mathematical problems from minus infinity to zero, or from minus infinity to plus infinity. But the thing in mathematics is you don't actually have to work through each point from minus infinity to zero one at a time and take a finite amount of time to do that. No, it's a mathematical tool. And this is where people get confused. And I read an article recently, actually last week, mathematicians saying most scientists actually often get confused about distinguishing between an infinite number of imaginary things that we use in math, or how we use infinity in mathematics, and infinity in reality. But I think the consensus is that, a lot of scientists realize, no, you're not going to have an infinity in reality. You get some absurd contradictions or paradoxes. So there's not an infinite number of universes out there.
So we started this conversation because somebody left a comment arguing that there was no consensus that the universe had a beginning from science. And it was an assertion because there's no proof to back up that statement.
Yeah.
Why is it important?
Well, there's massive philosophical implications if the universe had a beginning. And quite simply, whatever begins to exist must have been caused by something. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe must have been caused by something else out there. And so then we're the physical universe. In fact, it's nature itself. And that's where it gets really awkward or difficult for, let's say, a person committed to be an atheist. This is where things start to become unraveled. Because when we talk about the universe, often people will say, well, maybe something else physical out there caused this universe to come into existence. Maybe we live in some sort of a multiverse with a chain of universes, each progressing from the other. And in that case, our universe was maybe a quantum event at the event horizon of another universe and so forth. But as I have just shown, mathematics tells us that we cannot have traversed an infinite number of previous universes before we got to this one. We'll never get to this one. So that itself requires a beginning. And I think there's a general consensus by high-profile physicists and mathematicians that is the case, even if we have a multiverse. For example, George Ellis and some colleagues published a paper on infinities in the journal Nature, or was it Nature Mathematics or Nature Physics? I can't recall right off the top of my head, but it's one of the Nature's parallel publications, arguing that, they're believing that we have an infinite number of real things in reality is really indefensible. We cannot defend that. And in fact, there's some very good reasons. Logic dictates that can't happen. In addition, Paul Davies, for example, another theoretical physicist or cosmologist, concludes that even if we postulate a number of previous universes giving rise to this one, some sort of a multiverse system where universes are spawned from universes and so forth, that still requires a beginning. And Paul Davies acknowledges that. And why would they acknowledge that? Mathematics dictates there's going to have to be a beginning if we're talking about real things that occupy a discrete amount of time and a sequence of events. So there's no escape. In fact, there was an article several years ago published in New Scientist, and I think I mentioned this, why physicists cannot escape a creation event, it was called. They weren't implying that God, creation by God. They were just saying something created the universe. This is why so many materialists will essentially invoke, a grasp at irrational straws to avoid being faced with the beginning to nature itself. Because if nature had a beginning, no, go ahead, Sheldon.
Well, and that's why people are making these comments, because they're they hear what you're saying. There needs to be a beginning. Something needs to have created this. That puts them in a situation where they have to either say it's intelligence that created it or total chance, which even that has issues.
Yes.
So
chance is not going to get you out of this one.
So now you get into the intelligence design. Why is something with such great intelligence that it can create the universe doing it? And why are we here? And all of that stuff. Yeah. So yeah, it's amazing how it all comes down to that.
Yeah.
And yeah, so some of the comments are very interesting because there's a spinning that's going on there, and eventually, if people are going to have to make a choice, and
at the end of the day, what I see in these conversations is that a person, now they might start the conversation thinking belief in God is irrational and illogical, simply because they've never seriously, logically, and rationally considered it. That's at the beginning of the conversation. But what I find is that if they're going to deny that the universe had a beginning, or if they're going to deny the existence of the supernatural, for example, as the foundation and cause of physical reality, they're going to have to at some point depart from critical thinking and rational thought and enter the realm of irrational belief. That basically it's a priori commitment to materialism, and at all costs, even at the cost of rational thinking. But the biggest problem with committing yourself to materialism, or the things that are material, is we know the material things had a beginning. Now you have a problem. What brought the material world into existence if it had a beginning? And that's a it's got huge philosophical implications. In fact, Stephen Hawking, who worked very hard to try and find a solution to this, does acknowledge in that article I mentioned on why physicists cannot escape a creation event in New Scientist. Stephen Hawking he did concede that if the universe had a beginning, then we will have to consider, basically, how did he put it? How did he frame it? The hand of God, that's what he said. The hand of God, we'll have to seriously take that into consideration then. That's Hawking. Like, he's bright enough, he was brilliant. Unfortunately, brilliance comes sometimes with rational, critical thinking as well. But he saw what the implications were. It's the hand of God, and he said that, and he's quoted in that article, and there's no escape if the universe had a beginning. So he worked hard to try and come up, and he came up with mathematical models. But the problem is none of them came close to working when you apply it to reality. And it has to do, again, with everything in your mathematical model must map to something in reality. And that's where reality is the final test as to whether your mathematical model is going to be legit or not.
Which, again, like if you're if you're focusing on math to solve your problems with nature, you're going to run into the infinity problems.
Yep.
And then get back to the where'd we come from.
And you know that this is like a lot of people can't believe that scientists aren't aware of this. And I'd have to say, you know, I did an undergraduate degree in physics, and we had a lot of math in that program. I did an advanced math course at the University of Waterloo, gained more math. And then I also did an engineering degree in mechanical engineering. There was a lot more math in that, including infinite set theory and differential equations, but not once. In both of those degrees, not once. And then I did a PhD in biophysics. Not once was the topic ever broached or ever brought out for discussion about the possibility of countable infinite sets in reality. Simply because we never run into them in reality, and science deals with reality. And because there are no such things as countable infinite sets of something, of real things in reality, we just don't deal with that. In mathematics, yes. But people need to be very clear on this. There is a world of difference between a mathematical model and reality, just as there is a world of difference between a science fiction story where they're traveling around the universe in an interstellar spacecraft going faster than the speed of light and reality. It's a whole different ballgame there when we're faced with Einstein's special theory of relativity and how the mass of a spacecraft increases to infinity at the speed of light and so forth. We have some serious problems in reality exploring the universe with interstellar spacecraft. But when you put words together to construct a model of how we could explore the world, the universe, we call that model science fiction stories, it doesn't follow that therefore it's feasible that is possible in reality. In the same way, mathematical models are really another way of creating fiction using the language of mathematics. But don't conclude that this work of fiction corresponds to reality unless reality matches it on every key point. Same with science fiction. There has to be a correspondence with reality. In fact, that brings us face to face with how one of the primary definitions of true beliefs, called the correspondence theory, and that is this: a belief is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. And you can apply that to mathematical models as well. Mathematical model is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. Same with science fiction stories.
It's yeah, the more I talk about this with you, it's like, okay, how can people go through life with the idea of, well, science has the answers, when there's such a huge gap between reality and some theories or models or whatever, and these conversations are happening continually on your channel in the comments. So if you're watching and you're like, no, you guys are totally wrong, go ahead.
Yeah, for
Post
sure.
in the comments again, but bring something new, because the same conversations are happening over and over and over again, and the answers aren't there.
I find the challenge is I've been handling these same questions for years, and I can handle them in the same way you can drive down a road if you've been driving for years. You can drive from A to B and you hardly even have to exercise yourself. What I find the challenge is, though, is that it's not good enough just to give a technical answer. I find the challenge is to give an answer that the other person understands. And that's one of the challenges. The second is many people are so absolutely sure that they are right that any evidence you present doesn't count. Right. It's kind of like, I actually know some people who believe that the earth is flat. I've had conversations, and it doesn't matter what kind of evidence I will bring up. there's always a way to dodge it or maneuver around it.
Yeah.
So it's the same problem as people will tend to believe what they want to believe despite the evidence. That's some people. Still, there's others that are genuinely interested and they see the logic behind it.
Well, and it often has that that need for if you believe there is an opening for intelligence design, it makes you answer the question, and then you get into a belief that you might be accountable to something. You might have to give up control. You might have to recognize that there is stuff that's bigger than you, that has plans for you, and it's hard.
Yeah, in fact, I would say with a very high degree of confidence that the objections to believing in God are not scientific. They're very minor compared to the psychological obstacles in a person's mind. And let's say maybe I would say spiritual as well. Now, spiritual, maybe I could define that a little bit clearer. There are certain aspects of ourself that it's kind of hard to define whether this is psychological or spiritual, but there's a certain pride that humanity tends to have. And you'll see it all the time in movies, science fiction articles, but also in a lot of other movies. And that is, in general, we don't like anyone else to be more powerful than we are. We don't like to have to take orders from anybody. We resent it when somebody has authority over us. And so one way to deal with this is pretend that there is no God, is to maybe one of the comments just yesterday in one of my discussions on my YouTube channel was basically he says I'm lying when I talk about the universe having a beginning and that it can't be a natural cause bringing nature into existence. It has to be something independent of nature. He says I'm lying, and I thought about, well, like it doesn't follow that if someone says something that you disagree with, that therefore they're lying. They actually might be telling the truth, and it might be just that you don't want to believe what they're saying. The other thing is, and I suggested this to him, I said, it doesn't follow that I'm lying simply because you don't want to believe what I say, but could I suggest that maybe you are lying to yourself in trying to convince yourself there is no God? You're not being honest with yourself. And that's a question I think people need to ask. So who believe that science explains everything. Science explains some of the biggest questions, and perhaps the biggest one that we're faced with when we look out the window is, where did nature come from? And why I say science cannot explain it, I will also go further than that. I'll say science will never, ever explain where nature came from. Why is that? Because whatever it was that caused nature to come into existence cannot be itself nature or natural. Just as a woman cannot give birth to herself, so nature cannot have given birth to itself. It has to be something else, and that something else cannot be natural. And so you have two categories here: natural, not natural. And this not natural category would include, basically we have another name for that. It's called the supernatural. So you got natural, supernatural, and there's really no other categories between the two. If supernatural is defined as the set of all things that are not dependent on space, time, matter, and energy. So if you have only two options for the origin of nature, and one of those options is logically impossible, that is a natural explanation, then the other option, which is the supernatural origin for nature, is necessarily true. It's not that maybe it's true. It is logically necessary to be true if there's no way out in this one. It's kind of like checkmate, where if it is true checkmate in chess, you're done. And in the same way, atheism, if it denies the existence of the supernatural, is done when we talk about the origin of nature itself, because it entails a non-natural or supernatural origin for nature.
Yeah. I'm very interested to see how the conversations resolve, because eventually it's are you willing to recognize the potential that there is something beyond what you can see? And often I'm not willing to go there. But then it's not a question of whether you're believing in science or not. It's a question of what are you willing to give up? And yeah. Those of you who are watching, later on, leave a comment in the chat, leave a comment on YouTube, or come over to kirkdurston.com. Send in your comments. We want to hear from you. If you can convince us, I'm very open to listening to what your thoughts are, because it would be very fun to have a new conversation around this topic, where we get into some other things as well. So, Kirk, stay away from the bears, and
I will. I'll try. We'll try.
Yeah.
I've had a lot more encounters than just the ones we mentioned, but you never know when you're going to run into another one when you're out in the wilderness.
Or when you walk outside, there might just be one sitting right in front of you, because you live in the wilderness. Yeah.
Surprise, given where I'm living right now, but.
Alrighty. Well, we will talk to you later. Again, leave the likes, comments, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell if you want to be notified of when we're going to go live next. We'll be back next week, I believe, and maybe we'll prepare a little bit.
Let me see. Next week. Yes, we will.
Yeah, we'll be back.
Oh, wait a sec. Wait a sec. I think I'm Wednesday. I think I'm gone next. I think I'm actually flying to Winnipeg next week on Wednesday.
Hey, we should do lunch.
That's possible. That's possible, because I actually don't have any plans. We're going to be setting up plans, because there's a lot of people I'd like to meet with in Winnipeg, but that is possible.
All right. Give me a shout.
Okay.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.